Richard Nixon occupied the most powerful office on earth, yet inside it, he lived like a man under siege. He saw enemies everywhere, in the press, on the streets, even in the halls of his own government. So he made a list. He created a secret team of plumbers to plug the leaks. And in his war against these enemies, he came to a fateful conclusion. The law did not apply to him. This is not just the story of the Watergate scandal. This is the story of Richard Nixon and how his deepest paranoia poisoned a nation and led to his ruin. The roots of the contradictory man, Richard Nixon, lie deep in the arid soil of Yorba Linda, California, 1913. Born into a poor Quaker family on a failing lemon farm, his childhood was not one of ease, but of relentless work and hardship. This world of scarcity was soon darkened by profound tragedy. Nixon lost 2 of his brothers to illness. The grief and immense financial strain placed a heavy burden on young Richard, forging in him a burning, all-consuming ambition to escape poverty, to overcome adversity, and to achieve the success his brothers never could. This drive, born from loss and struggle, would become the engine of his entire life, propelling him from the dusty fields of California toward the world stage. At Whittier High School, Richard was not the most popular or charismatic student, but he was, by all accounts, one of the most determined. He threw himself into his studies and extracurricular activities with a ferocious energy. He was a formidable debater, known for his meticulous preparation, his logical arguments, and his killer instinct. He would spend hours in the library, researching every angle of a topic, anticipating his opponent's arguments. This was where he first honed the rhetorical skills and the strategic adversarial mindset that would later define his political career. He also discovered a passion for theater, where the shy, reserved boy could inhabit other personas, learning the art of performance and persuasion. He served as student body president, an early sign of his burgeoning leadership abilities. Despite his family's limited resources, he often wore his brother Harold's hand-me-down clothes. He refused to be defined by his circumstances. He was relentlessly building a new identity, one based on intellect, discipline, and achievement. He continued this pattern at Whittier College, a small Quaker institution. He was a history major, a serious and diligent student. He played football, not with any great natural talent, but with a tenacity that impressed his coaches. He was often used as a tackling dummy, absorbing punishment without complaint, always getting back up. It was a perfect metaphor for his approach to life. He continued with debate and drama, and he co-founded a new student society, the Orthogonians, as a social alternative to the more established, affluent fraternities. It was another early example of his tendency to see the world in terms of insiders and outsiders, and his drive to create his own path to influence. His academic excellence was undeniable, and it opened a door he could have only dreamed of. He received a scholarship to attend Duke University School of Law, one of the most prestigious law schools in the country. In 1934, he boarded a train and left California for the first time, heading to the alien world of the American South. At Duke, he was once again the outsider, the poor, serious Californian amidst the sons of the Southern elite. He responded, as he always had, with punishing hard work. He lived in a Spartan, unheated room, and his classmates nicknamed him Iron Butt for the long hours he spent studying in the library. He was driven not just to succeed, but to dominate. His efforts paid off. He graduated near the top of his class in 1937, a remarkable achievement that was a testament to his iron will and intellectual prowess. With a Duke law degree in hand, he could have sought a position at a prestigious Wall Street firm. Instead, he returned to Whittier. He joined a local law firm, Wingert and Bewley, and for a brief moment his life seemed to settle into a predictable, respectable rhythm. He was a small-town lawyer handling divorces, wills, and minor business disputes. But the quiet life was not for him. His ambition, forged in the fires of his youth, still burned. It was during this period that he met Thelma Pat Ryan, a high school teacher with a background as difficult as his own. He was instantly smitten, and he pursued her with the same single-minded determination he applied to everything else. She initially rebuffed his advances, but he was relentless, even driving her on dates with her other suitors. They bonded over their shared love of theater, acting together in a local production. In 1940, they married, beginning a partnership that would endure through the incredible highs and devastating lows that lay ahead. Then the world changed. The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 plunged the United States into World War II. Nixon, despite his Quaker background, which traditionally espoused pacifism, felt an undeniable call to duty. In 1942, he and Pat moved to Washington, D.C., where he briefly worked for the Office of Price Administration. But a desk job felt insufficient. He wanted to serve in uniform. He applied for a commission in the U.S. Navy, and in August 1942, he was sworn in as a lieutenant junior grade. Nixon's war was not one of frontline combat. He was assigned to the South Pacific Combat Air Transport Command, serving as a logistics officer. His job was to manage the flow of supplies and personnel to air bases on a string of remote Pacific islands. It was unglamorous but essential work requiring meticulous planning and organizational skill. He earned a reputation for efficiency and dedication, but it was during the long, boring hours between cargo flights that another side of Nixon emerged. He became an exceptionally skilled poker player. His quiet, observant nature, his ability to read people, and his cool, calculating mind made him a natural at the game. He approached poker not as a game of chance, but as a battle of psychology and strategy. By the end of the war, he had reportedly won several $1,000s from his fellow officers, a significant sum at the time, which he would use to help finance his first political campaign. His wartime service, which saw him rise to the rank of lieutenant commander, was a transformative experience. It expanded his worldview, built his image as a patriot and a war hero, and crucially, it connected him with a network of influential businessmen and community leaders who saw in this serious, ambitious young officer a man with a future. Upon his return to California in 1946, that future arrived with surprising speed. A group of frustrated Republican businessmen in his home district, known as the Committee of 100, were searching for a fresh face to challenge the popular 5-term Democratic incumbent, Jerry Voorhis. They were looking for a young veteran with a clean record and a willingness to fight. They found their man in Richard Nixon. Nixon, who had never before run for public office, seized the opportunity with a predatory zeal. He launched his campaign with an almost ferocious energy. His platform was clear, sharp, and perfectly attuned to the anxieties of the emerging Cold War. He was a staunch anti-communist, and he would paint Voorhis, a respected New Deal liberal, as dangerously soft on the Red Menace. The campaign was a masterclass in aggressive modern political tactics. Nixon's team linked Voorhis to communist-backed organizations, a tactic criticized as misleading. In their debates, Nixon was relentless, constantly putting Voorhis on the defensive, questioning his patriotism. It was a brutal, often ugly campaign, but it was devastatingly effective. Nixon had outmaneuvered and overwhelmed a seasoned incumbent, winning a stunning upset victory. He was going to Congress. His political career had begun, and he had already established the playbook that would define his ascent: attack, polarize, and never, ever back down. Once in Washington, the freshman congressman from California wasted no time making a name for himself. He secured a coveted spot on the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, the controversial committee at the forefront of the nation's hunt for communist subversives. It was the perfect stage for the ambitious anti-communist crusader. And in 1948, the case that would catapult him from obscurity to national fame landed in the committee's lap. Whittaker Chambers, a senior editor at Time magazine and a self-confessed former communist spy, testified before HUAC that Alger Hiss, a distinguished former State Department official who had been at the Yalta Conference and helped found the United Nations, had been a member of his underground communist cell in the 1930s. Hiss was the picture of East Coast establishment elegance. He appeared before the committee and calmly, coolly denied everything. Many on the committee and in the press were inclined to believe him. The case seemed to be falling apart, but not for Richard Nixon. He saw something in Hiss's carefully crafted testimony, a hint of evasion, a flicker of deceit. And in Chambers, he saw a troubled but sincere man telling a difficult truth. While others on the committee were ready to drop the investigation, Nixon pushed forward with a relentless, almost obsessive conviction. He famously met with Chambers at his farm, where Chambers provided details that only a close associate would know. Nixon arranged a dramatic face-to-face confrontation between Hiss and Chambers, where Hiss was finally forced to admit he knew Chambers, though under a different name. The turning point came when Chambers led investigators to a hollowed-out pumpkin on his Maryland farm, where he had hidden microfilm copies of stolen State Department documents. These pumpkin papers, some of which were in Hiss's handwriting, were the damning evidence. Because the statute of limitations for espionage had expired, Hiss was ultimately convicted of perjury for lying under oath. For Richard Nixon, the Hiss case was a career-defining triumph. It vindicated his anti-communist crusade and established him as a national figure. He was seen as a tenacious, fearless investigator who had exposed a traitor at the highest levels of government. To his supporters, he was a hero. To his detractors, he was a ruthless opportunist who had built his career on smear tactics and red baiting. Whichever view one took, one thing was undeniable: Richard Nixon had arrived. This newfound prominence set the stage for his next move. In 1950, he set his sights on the U.S. Senate. His opponent was the liberal Democratic Congresswoman, Helen Gahagan Douglas. The campaign would be even more brutal and polarizing than his race against Voorhis. Nixon and his campaign manager, the brilliant and ruthless Murray Chotiner, employed a strategy of relentless attack. They highlighted Douglas's liberal voting record, linking her positions to those of a radical left-wing congressman, Vito Marcantonio. They printed flyers on pink paper, subtly and not so subtly suggesting she was a communist sympathizer. Nixon famously dubbed her the Pink Lady, a label that stuck. Nixon's campaign branded her the Pink Lady, and critics attributed to him the notorious line that she was pink right down to her underwear. It was a vicious, deeply personal campaign that solidified Nixon's reputation as a no-holds-barred political brawler. He won the election by a comfortable margin, and at the age of 37, he was a United States Senator. His rapid, seemingly unstoppable ascent had not gone unnoticed by the leaders of the Republican Party. As the 1952 presidential election approached, the party's likely nominee, the beloved war hero General Dwight D. Eisenhower, was looking for a running mate. He needed someone young, someone with strong anti-communist credentials, and someone who could be an aggressive campaigner, allowing Eisenhower to remain above the political fray. The choice fell on the junior senator from California. At just 39 years old, Richard Nixon was nominated for the vice presidency of the United States. It was a meteoric rise, almost unimaginable for the boy from the failed lemon farm. But his greatest political crisis, a moment that would test his resilience and his unique ability to connect with the American people, was just around the corner. The crisis erupted in September 1952 when the New York Post ran a story with the headline, "Secret Nixon Fund." The story revealed that a group of wealthy California businessmen had provided Nixon with a private fund of about $18,000 to cover his political expenses. The implication was clear. Nixon was beholden to special interests, a politician for sale. The story exploded. Democrats called for his removal from the ticket. Many of Eisenhower's own advisors urged him to drop Nixon. The Dump Nixon movement gained momentum, and for a few tense days it seemed his political career was over, about to be cut short in a blaze of scandal. Eisenhower, ever the cautious general, was non-committal, stating that Nixon needed to be as clean as a hound's tooth. The pressure mounted. Nixon's advisors decided on a bold, desperate gamble. He would take his case directly to the American people in a live televised address. On the evening of September 23, 1952, a nervous Richard Nixon sat in a Los Angeles studio, surrounded by his family, and prepared to give the speech of his life. He spoke for 30 minutes, laying out his family's finances in meticulous, almost painful detail. He listed their assets, their debts, the mortgage on their house. He portrayed himself not as a corrupt politician, but as an ordinary man of modest means, a man who had not profited from public service. He attacked his critics, defended the fund as a necessary tool to fight communism. And then, in a moment of pure political theater, he addressed one particular gift the family had received. A supporter in Texas, he explained, had sent his children a little black and white cocker spaniel. His 6-year-old daughter, Tricia, had named him Checkers. And Nixon said, his voice thick with emotion, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it. It was a masterstroke. The Checkers speech, as it came to be known, was a political sensation. The public response was overwhelming. Telegrams and phone calls flooded into the Republican National Committee, running more than 100 to 1 in Nixon's favor. He had bypassed the political establishment and the hostile press, forging a direct emotional connection with millions of Americans in their living rooms. He had transformed a potential career-ending scandal into a demonstration of his fighting spirit and his common touch. The next day, a convinced Eisenhower met him at the airport and declared, "Dick, you're my boy." The ticket was safe. In November, Eisenhower and Nixon swept to a landslide victory. For the next 8 years, Richard Nixon served as vice president, redefining what had traditionally been a ceremonial role. He was one of the most active and influential vice presidents in American history. Eisenhower, who suffered a heart attack in 1955, delegated significant responsibilities to him. Nixon chaired cabinet meetings and presided over the National Security Council. He became Eisenhower's goodwill ambassador, embarking on extensive foreign tours to Latin America, Asia, and Africa. These trips were often perilous. In Caracas, Venezuela, his motorcade was attacked by an angry mob, but they gave him invaluable experience in foreign affairs, allowing him to build relationships with world leaders and deepen his understanding of global politics. His most famous moment on the world stage came in 1959 at an American exhibition in Moscow, where he engaged in a spontaneous finger-pointing debate with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in front of a model American kitchen. The kitchen debate, as it was called, was a symbolic clash of ideologies, and images of Nixon standing up to the blustering Soviet leader played brilliantly back home, cementing his image as a tough, knowledgeable statesman. As Eisenhower's second term drew to a close, Nixon was the undisputed heir apparent. He easily secured the Republican presidential nomination in 1960. His opponent was the young, charismatic Democratic senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. The election would be one of the closest and most consequential in American history. It pitted two men who, in many ways, were mirror images of each other. Both veterans, both fiercely intelligent and ambitious, both dedicated anti-communists. But their styles were worlds apart. Kennedy was the embodiment of youthful vigor and aristocratic grace. Nixon was the hard-working, often brooding symbol of middle-class striving. The campaign is best remembered for the nation's first-ever televised presidential debates. In the first debate, Kennedy, well-rested and tan, appeared cool and confident. Nixon, who was recovering from a knee injury and refused to wear television makeup, appeared pale, sweaty, and haggard under the harsh studio lights. Radio listeners thought Nixon had won the debate on substance, but the far larger television audience saw a clear visual victory for Kennedy. In an instant, the power of image in politics was established. The election that November was agonizingly close. Kennedy won the popular vote by just over 100,000 votes out of nearly 69 million cast. There were credible allegations of voter fraud in key states like Illinois and Texas. Nixon's supporters urged him to challenge the results, but he refused, believing a constitutional crisis would damage the country. It was a moment of patriotic grace, but the defeat was a crushing blow to a man who had come so far. He returned to California and, in 1962, decided to run for governor. It was a political miscalculation. He lost to the incumbent, Pat Brown. The day after the election, a bitter and exhausted Nixon faced the press. He lashed out at the reporters he had long believed were biased against him. "For 16 years, ever since the Hiss case, you've had a lot of fun," he snarled. He concluded with a line that would become instantly famous. "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." With that, he walked away. His political career appeared to be over, buried under the weight of two consecutive humiliating defeats. The wilderness years had begun, but to count Richard Nixon out, as history had already shown, was a profound mistake. For in the crucible of defeat, he would begin to meticulously plan one of the most stunning political comebacks in modern history. For most men, the declaration, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore," would have been a political epitaph, the bitter final words of a failed career. But Richard Nixon was not most men. His wilderness years, following his crushing defeats in 1960 and 1962, were not a period of quiet retirement. They were a time of calculated hibernation, of meticulous recalibration. He moved his family from California to New York, joining the prestigious Wall Street law firm of Nixon, Mudge, Rose, Guthrie, and Alexander. The move was strategic, placing him at the financial and media center of the nation, and lending him an aura of establishment respectability he had long craved. He was no longer just a politician from Whittier. He was a global statesman, a man of substance. He transformed himself into the Republican Party's most dedicated servant. While other party leaders licked their wounds after Lyndon Johnson's landslide victory over Barry Goldwater in 1964, Nixon was on the road, campaigning tirelessly for Republican candidates in down-ballot races. In the 1966 midterm elections, he traveled to 35 states, raising millions of dollars and helping the party make significant gains. He was not just giving speeches, he was building a vast network of loyalty, collecting political IOUs from congressmen, governors, and party officials across the country. Every handshake, every fundraising dinner was a brick in the foundation of his eventual comeback. He also worked to create a new Nixon. He penned articles on foreign policy for respected journals, traveled the world meeting with heads of state, and presented himself as a more mature, thoughtful figure. The aggressive, sometimes shrill campaigner of the 1950s was replaced by a seasoned elder statesman, a man who had known defeat and had emerged wiser, more tempered. He let others, like California Governor Ronald Reagan, represent the fiery right wing of the party, while he carefully positioned himself in the center, the voice of reason and experience. All the while, the nation he sought to lead was tearing itself apart. The Vietnam War, which had been a distant conflict, escalated dramatically under President Johnson. The draft swept up a generation of young men, and the weekly casualty lists grew longer and longer. The anti-war movement exploded on college campuses and in the streets, creating a deep and bitter cultural divide. The cities burned with racial unrest. Then came 1968, a year of almost unimaginable trauma. The Tet Offensive in January, a massive coordinated attack by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, shattered the government's claims that there was light at the end of the tunnel in Vietnam. In March, a weary and beleaguered Lyndon Johnson stunned the world by announcing he would not seek re-election. Just days later, the nation's moral leader, Martin Luther King Jr., was assassinated in Memphis, sparking riots across the country. And then in June, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, who seemed poised to capture the Democratic nomination, was shot and killed in Los Angeles. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago that summer devolved into a televised spectacle of chaos, with police brutally clashing with protesters in the streets. Into this maelstrom of violence and division, Richard Nixon stepped forward as the voice of stability. He was the candidate of the silent majority, his term for the ordinary, law-abiding middle-class Americans who were neither protesting in the streets nor joining the counterculture. They were, he argued, the forgotten Americans. Tired of the chaos, fearful of the future, and desperate for a return to order. His campaign slogan was simple and powerful: law and order. He promised to restore respect for the flag, to stand up for the police, and to bring an honorable end to the war in Vietnam. He deftly navigated the Republican primaries, fending off challenges from the more liberal Nelson Rockefeller and the more conservative Ronald Reagan, securing the nomination on the first ballot. His general election campaign against Johnson's Vice President Hubert Humphrey was a masterpiece of political strategy. While Humphrey was saddled with the legacy of an unpopular war and a fractured party, Nixon projected an image of calm competence. He also executed his controversial but politically brilliant Southern strategy. For a century, the American South had been a Democratic stronghold, but the Democratic Party's embrace of the civil rights movement had alienated millions of white Southern voters. Nixon's campaign sent a clear, though often coded message to these voters. He understood their frustrations with federal desegregation orders and the rapid pace of social change. He signaled that he would appoint conservative judges and would not push for aggressive busing policies. It was a strategy that exploited racial anxieties to break the Democratic Party's hold on the South, a political realignment that would reshape American politics for decades to come. In November 1968, Richard Nixon completed the greatest political comeback in American history. He won the presidency in a close election, defeating Humphrey and the fiery third-party candidate, segregationist George Wallace. The boy from the lemon farm, the man who had been politically buried just 6 years earlier, was now the most powerful man in the world. He inherited a nation at war with itself, a nation deeply wounded and profoundly divided. The task before him was monumental. The shadow of Vietnam loomed over everything. The war was the open wound in the American psyche, a conflict that had cost over 30,000 American lives by the time Nixon took office and was consuming the nation's resources and its soul. Nixon knew he had to end the war, but he was determined to do so in a way that preserved what he called peace with honor. He would not be the first American president to lose a war. His strategy, developed in close concert with his brilliant and equally complex national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, was a multifaceted approach they called Vietnamization. The plan was to gradually withdraw American troops while simultaneously building up the South Vietnamese military so it could defend itself. This would de-Americanize the conflict and reduce the weekly casualty figures that were poisoning public opinion back home. Troop levels, which had peaked at over 543,000 in 1969, began a steady decline. But this withdrawal was coupled with a dramatic and secret escalation of the war. Nixon and Kissinger believed that to force the North Vietnamese to negotiate in good faith, they had to demonstrate American strength and unpredictability. In March 1969, Nixon authorized Operation Menu, a secret bombing campaign against North Vietnamese sanctuaries and supply lines in neutral Cambodia. For over a year, American B-52s dropped more than 100,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia, all while the American public and much of Congress were kept in the dark. It was a bold, ruthless move aimed at buying time for Vietnamization to work, but it was also a dangerous expansion of the war with devastating long-term consequences, including the destabilization of Cambodia and the rise of the genocidal Khmer Rouge. The domestic front was its own kind of battlefield. The anti-war movement, far from being appeased by troop withdrawals, grew larger and more vocal. In the fall of 1969, the moratorium to end the war in Vietnam saw millions of Americans participate in massive demonstrations across the country. Nixon's response was to go on the offensive. In a televised address in November, he bypassed the press and the protesters, appealing directly to the great silent majority of my fellow Americans. It was a powerful speech that rallied his supporters and further polarized the nation. The tensions reached a tragic breaking point in the spring of 1970. Nixon, frustrated with the slow pace of negotiations, announced an American and South Vietnamese incursion into Cambodia to clear out enemy sanctuaries. The announcement reignited the anti-war movement, and protests erupted on college campuses nationwide. At Kent State University in Ohio on May 4, 1970. National Guardsmen, who had been called in to quell the protests, opened fire on a crowd of student demonstrators. They killed 4 and wounded 9. 10 days later at Jackson State College in Mississippi, police fired on a dormitory, killing 2 students. The images from Kent State, particularly the photograph of a young woman screaming in anguish over the body of a fellow student, became iconic symbols of a nation at war with its own children. Despite the domestic turmoil, Nixon and Kissinger pursued their grand strategy with relentless focus. The long and arduous peace negotiations in Paris between Kissinger and North Vietnam's Le Duc Tho dragged on for years, marked by breakthroughs and breakdowns. In a final brutal effort to force a settlement, Nixon ordered the Christmas bombing of 1972, a massive 11-day bombing campaign against Hanoi and Haiphong. Finally, on January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of all remaining U.S. troops, and the return of American prisoners of war. By March 1973, The last American combat soldiers had left Vietnam. Nixon declared he had achieved peace with honor, but it was a fragile peace. 2 years later, in April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, and South Vietnam collapsed. The war was over, but its legacy of division, mistrust, and tragedy would linger for generations. While Vietnam consumed the headlines, Nixon and Kissinger were executing a diplomatic revolution that would fundamentally reshape the Cold War. For more than 2 decades, the United States had refused to recognize the existence of the People's Republic of China, viewing it as an illegitimate outlaw state. But Nixon, the lifelong anti-communist, saw a monumental opportunity. The growing ideological and border disputes between China and the Soviet Union, the Sino-Soviet split, had shattered the myth of a monolithic communist bloc. Nixon believed that by engaging with China, he could drive an even deeper wedge between the two communist giants, creating a new triangular balance of power that would benefit the United States. It was a breathtakingly audacious idea. The process began in absolute secrecy. Using Pakistan as an intermediary, Kissinger embarked on a secret mission to Beijing in July 1971. The world believed he was in Islamabad, sick with a stomach ailment. In reality, he was meeting with Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, laying the groundwork for a presidential visit. The breakthrough was announced to a stunned world by Nixon himself. The reaction was seismic. This diplomatic gambit, which came to be known as ping-pong diplomacy after an American table tennis team was invited to China, was a geopolitical masterstroke. In February 1972, Richard Nixon and his wife, Pat, landed in Beijing. The images were surreal and captivating. The American president, the man who had built his career fighting communism, walking the Great Wall, toasting with Chinese leaders in the Great Hall of the People, and, most remarkably, meeting with the aging, enigmatic chairman, Mao Zedong. The week-long visit was a meticulously choreographed piece of political theater, but it produced a substantive result, the Shanghai Communique. In this carefully worded document, the U.S. acknowledged the One China principle, a crucial concession that recognized Beijing's claim to Taiwan without formally abandoning the island. It was a piece of diplomatic genius that paved the way for the full normalization of relations in 1979. The opening to China was Nixon's most brilliant and enduring foreign policy achievement, a move of such strategic foresight that it fundamentally altered the global landscape and helped set the stage for the end of the Cold War. The China opening was also a powerful message to the other communist superpower. The Soviet Union, now fearing a U.S.-China alliance against them, became much more receptive to American overtures. Just 3 months after his trip to Beijing in May 1972, Nixon was in Moscow for a summit with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. This was the high point of the policy known as détente, a French word meaning a relaxation of tensions. The goal was not to end the ideological struggle, but to manage the superpower rivalry and reduce the risk of nuclear war. The Moscow summit produced 2 landmark agreements. The first was the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT I, which froze the number of offensive nuclear missiles at existing levels. The second was the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which sharply limited the development of defensive missile systems, thereby ensuring that both sides remained vulnerable to retaliation. A grim but stable logic known as mutually assured destruction. Détente was a pragmatic, clear-eyed approach to the Cold War, a shift away from pure confrontation and toward a new era of negotiation. Nixon's crisis management skills were put to the ultimate test in October 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. On the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. The initial Israeli losses were staggering, and for a few days the nation's survival seemed in doubt. While some in his administration hesitated, fearing an Arab oil embargo, Nixon made a decisive choice. "We will not let Israel go down," he declared. He ordered a massive emergency airlift of military supplies to Israel, an operation codenamed Nickel Grass. U.S. cargo planes began flying tanks, artillery, and ammunition to the beleaguered Israeli forces. The tide of the war began to turn. The Soviets, seeing their Arab clients losing, threatened to intervene directly. In a tense late-night showdown, Nixon placed all U.S. military forces on a heightened nuclear alert, DEFCON 3, signaling to the Soviets that he would not be intimidated. The Soviets backed down. Nixon's decisive actions saved Israel, but they came at a price. The Arab members of OPEC retaliated by imposing a crippling oil embargo on the United States, leading to gas shortages and a severe energy crisis. Nevertheless, it was a masterful display of high-stakes, superpower diplomacy. While his foreign policy triumphs often seemed to overshadow his domestic agenda, Nixon's presidency also produced a surprisingly significant and in some cases progressive legacy at home. Responding to a powerful wave of public concern over pollution, dramatized by events like the burning Cuyahoga River and the first Earth Day in 1970, Nixon took decisive action. In 1970, he established the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, by executive order. He then went on to sign a raft of landmark environmental laws, including the Clean Air Act of 1970, the Clean Water Act of 1972, and the Endangered Species Act of 1973. For a conservative president, it was an astonishing record of environmental protection, a legacy that endures to this day. On the economic front, he faced a new and confounding problem: stagflation, the unprecedented combination of high inflation and high unemployment that defied traditional economic solutions. In a shocking reversal of his own free market principles, Nixon took dramatic action in August 1971. In what became known as the Nixon shock, he announced a 90-day freeze on all wages and prices. More consequentially for the world, he unilaterally severed the U.S. dollar's link to gold, ending the Bretton Woods system that had governed international finance since World War II. It was a bold attempt to stabilize the American economy, though its long-term effects remain a subject of debate among economists. He also pursued his law and order agenda with vigor. He declared a war on drugs, calling drug abuse public enemy number one, and in 1973 he created the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA. While framed as a public health and safety issue, this new emphasis on enforcement would have long-term consequences, contributing to a massive expansion of the prison population that disproportionately affected minority communities. And in a move that significantly eased social tensions, he ended the military draft in 1973, establishing the all-volunteer force that continues to this day. This decision, while popular, was also a strategic one, aimed at diffusing the anti-war movement by removing one of its most potent recruiting tools. By 1972, Richard Nixon was at the apex of his power. His diplomatic triumphs in China and the Soviet Union were celebrated worldwide. He was withdrawing troops from Vietnam. The economy, though still troubled, seemed to be under control. He appeared to be a president of immense consequence, a leader who had restored order at home and reshaped the world abroad. The Democratic Party, meanwhile, nominated Senator George McGovern of South Dakota, an anti-war liberal who was perceived by many mainstream voters as too radical. The result was one of the most lopsided presidential elections in American history. Nixon's committee to re-elect the president, or CREEP, ran a flawless, well-funded campaign. In November, Nixon won a staggering 60.7% of the popular vote and carried 49 of the 50 states. It was a landslide of historic proportions, a powerful vindication of his presidency and his connection to the silent majority. He stood astride the American political world, seemingly invincible. But beneath the surface of this monumental triumph, the seeds of his destruction had already been sown. Just 5 months before the election, a seemingly minor event, a third-rate burglary, at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in a Washington office complex called the Watergate, had set in motion a chain of events that would unravel his presidency and plunge the nation into its greatest constitutional crisis. The storm was coming. In the heady days of 1972, as Richard Nixon stood at the zenith of his power, a landslide re-election all but certain, the White House was more than just the seat of government. It had become a fortress, a command bunker in a war against a vast array of perceived enemies. Inside the Oval Office, an atmosphere of suspicion and resentment festered, a deep-seated paranoia that saw threats lurking everywhere, in the anti-war movement, in the press, in the Washington establishment, and even within the government bureaucracy itself. Nixon's was a presidency that operated with a siege mentality. This wasn't just about political opposition. In the minds of Nixon and his inner circle, it was a battle for the soul of the nation. And in a war, the normal rules of engagement sometimes had to be suspended. This mindset led to the creation of the now infamous enemies list, a formal compilation of journalists, academics, politicians, and actors who were deemed hostile to the administration. The goal was to use the machinery of the federal government, tax audits from the IRS, denial of federal grants to screw our political enemies. But the paranoia ran deeper than just a list. In June of 1971, the New York Times began publishing excerpts from the Pentagon Papers, a top-secret internal history of the Vietnam War that had been leaked by a military analyst named Daniel Ellsberg. The papers revealed that successive administrations, both Democratic and Republican, had systematically lied to the American public about the war's progress. While the revelations were most damaging to his predecessors, Nixon was enraged. He saw the leak not as an act of whistleblowing, but as a treasonous assault on national security, a sign that the entire government was an untrustworthy sieve. He was determined to stop the leaks and to destroy Daniel Ellsberg personally. "We're going to get this son of a bitch," he was recorded saying. To carry out this mission, a covert White House unit was formed, reporting directly to Nixon's top domestic advisor, John Ehrlichman. They called themselves the Plumbers because their job was to plug leaks. Led by a young, fiercely loyal aide named Egil Bud Krog, their ranks included a former CIA officer and spy novelist, E. Howard Hunt, and a volatile, eccentric former FBI agent, G. Gordon Liddy. The Plumbers' first major operation was a direct assault on Ellsberg. Convinced that they could find information to blackmail or discredit him, they concocted a plan to break into the office of his psychiatrist in Beverly Hills, California. On the night of September 3rd, 1971, a team of plumbers, using CIA-supplied disguises and equipment, broke into the doctor's office, ransacked the files, but found nothing on Ellsberg. The crime went unsolved at the time, but it was a crucial dark precedent. A secret, illegal intelligence unit operating out of the White House itself had been unleashed. The line between politics and criminality had been crossed long before anyone had ever heard the name Watergate. G. Gordon Liddy, with his fanatical zeal, soon moved over to the committee to re-elect the president, or creep. There, he proposed a series of increasingly outlandish espionage plans against the Democrats, codenamed Gemstone, which included schemes for kidnapping, mugging, and using prostitutes to blackmail political opponents. After his initial $1 million budget was rejected, he came back with a more modest, but still illegal, plan to wiretap the Democratic National Committee headquarters, located on the 6th floor of the Watergate office building. The goal was to gather intelligence on the campaign strategy of Nixon's eventual opponent. On the night of June 17, 1972, a team led by James McCord, Creep's security coordinator, and a former CIA officer broke into the DNC offices for the second time, intending to fix a faulty wiretap they had installed weeks earlier. The team of 5 burglars, Bernard Barker, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, Frank Sturgis, and McCord himself, were caught in the act. A 24-year-old security guard named Frank Wills, making his rounds, noticed a piece of duct tape covering the latch on a basement door. He removed it. When he passed by again later and saw the door had been retaped, he knew something was wrong. He called the police. Plainclothes officers arrived and methodically searched the building, finding the 5 men dressed in business suits and wearing rubber gloves, hiding in an office. They were carrying wiretapping equipment, cameras, and, most curiously, sequentially numbered $100 bills. The initial reaction from the White House was one of dismissal. Press Secretary Ron Ziegler brushed it off as a third-rate burglary attempt. For months, the cover-up, which began almost the instant the burglars were arrested, seemed to be working. Top aides, including Nixon's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, and White House counsel John Dean, went into damage control. Documents were shredded at creep. E. Howard Hunt's name was found in one of the burglars' address books, directly linking the break-in to the White House. John Dean was instructed to manage the containment, to keep the cancer from reaching the presidency. Payments of hush money were arranged for the burglars and their families to ensure their silence. The most critical act of obstruction occurred just 6 days after the break-in, on June 23, 1972. In the Oval Office, Haldeman explained the situation to Nixon. The FBI's investigation was getting dangerously close to CREEP's secret funds. Nixon then gave a fateful order. He instructed Haldeman to have the CIA tell the FBI to halt its investigation into the Watergate money trail, falsely claiming it was a national security matter related to the Bay of Pigs. "You call the FBI," Nixon said, "and say that we wish for the country. Don't go any further into this case. Period." It was a direct illegal order to use one government agency to obstruct the criminal investigation of another. This later became known as the smoking gun conversation. But at the time, no one outside the room knew it had happened. The cover-up held, and in November, Nixon was reelected in his historic landslide. But the story refused to die, thanks in large part to 2 young, unheralded reporters at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. While much of the National Press Corps accepted the White House's denials, Woodward and Bernstein kept digging, driven by their editors, particularly the legendary Ben Bradlee. They followed the money, meticulously tracing the $100 bills found on the burglars back to a secret slush fund at CREEP. They conducted hundreds of interviews, often late at night, slowly piecing together a vast conspiracy of political espionage and sabotage. They were aided by a secret source, a high-level government official, whom Woodward had codenamed Deep Throat. Meeting in the eerie silence of an underground parking garage, Deep Throat would confirm their reporting and guide them, famously advising them to follow the money. Decades later, Deep Throat would be revealed as Mark Felt, the second in command at the FBI. The judiciary also refused to let the matter rest. Judge John J. Sirica, a tough, no-nonsense Republican appointee known as Maximum John for his harsh sentences, presided over the trial of the Watergate burglars. He was deeply skeptical of the official story that this was a simple burglary, unconnected to higher-ups. At the sentencing in March 1973, he read a letter he had received from one of the burglars, James McCord. In the letter, McCord blew the conspiracy wide open. He alleged that political pressure had been applied to the defendants to plead guilty and remain silent, that perjury had been committed during the trial, and that others were involved. McCord's letter was a bombshell. It confirmed what Woodward and Bernstein had been reporting and shattered the White House's wall of denial. The dam was beginning to break. In February 1973, the Senate voted unanimously to create a special committee to investigate the Watergate affair. Chaired by the courtly but tenacious Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, the Senate Watergate Committee began televised hearings in May. For the entire summer, the nation was riveted. One by one, former White House and campaign officials came before the committee, and the sordid story of the cover-up began to emerge. The hearings reached a stunning climax with the testimony of former White House counsel John Dean. For 5 days, Dean sat before the cameras and, in a flat, unemotional monotone, calmly laid out the entire conspiracy. He implicated Haldeman, Ehrlichman, former Attorney General John Mitchell, and ultimately the president himself. He spoke of the hush money, the enemy's list, and the all-consuming effort to contain the scandal. "I began by telling the president," Dean testified, "that there was a cancer on the presidency, that it was growing daily." Dean had no documents to prove his sensational claims. It was his word against the president's. The question of proof hung in the air until a dramatic moment on July 16, 1973. A mid-level White House aide named Alexander Butterfield was being questioned by a committee staffer. As a routine final question, the staffer asked Butterfield if he knew of any system that might verify Dean's testimony. Butterfield paused and then gave an answer that would change the course of American history. Yes, he revealed, there was a secret voice-activated taping system in the White House that automatically recorded all of the president's conversations in the Oval Office and on his telephones. The revelation was an absolute bombshell, an objective, verbatim record of the conversations John Dean had described actually existed. The tapes instantly became the holy grail of the Watergate investigation. The committee subpoenaed them. The new Watergate special prosecutor, a Harvard law professor named Archibald Cox, also subpoenaed them. President Nixon refused to comply, citing executive privilege and national security. He argued that a president's private conversations must remain confidential for the government to function. This set the stage for a constitutional crisis of epic proportions, a direct conflict between the power of the presidency and the rule of law. The confrontation came to a head on Saturday, October 20th, 1973, in an event that would be forever known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon, fed up with Cox's relentless pursuit of the tapes, ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire the special prosecutor. Richardson, who had promised the Senate during his confirmation hearings that he would not interfere with the investigation, refused the direct presidential order and resigned in protest. Nixon then ordered the Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to fire Cox. He too refused and was promptly fired. Finally, the third-ranking official at the Justice Department, Solicitor General Robert Bork, carried out the president's order and fired Cox. The public reaction was a firestorm of outrage. The White House was flooded with telegrams. The press decried the actions of an imperial president running roughshod over the law. For the first time, calls for Nixon's impeachment began to be heard in the halls of Congress. Under immense public pressure, Nixon was forced to appoint a new special prosecutor, a respected Texas lawyer named Leon Jaworski, and agreed to turn over some of the subpoenaed tapes. But when the tapes were delivered, investigators discovered a crucial gap: an 18-and-a-half-minute buzz of static in a key conversation between Nixon and Haldeman, just 3 days after the break-in. The White House blamed the erasure on a secretarial error, a story that was met with widespread ridicule. The battle for the remaining tapes continued, and the case, United States versus Nixon, went all the way to the Supreme Court. On July 24, 1974, the court, in a unanimous 8-0 decision, with Nixon's own appointee, William Rehnquist, recusing himself, delivered a historic ruling. They rejected the president's claim of absolute executive privilege and ordered him to turn over all the subpoenaed tapes. The rule of law had prevailed. The president was not above it. As the Supreme Court was ruling, the House Judiciary Committee was conducting its own televised impeachment hearings. In late July, after weeks of debate, the committee, in a solemn and bipartisan vote, approved 3 articles of impeachment against President Richard Nixon for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Back at the White House, Nixon's lawyers began the grim task of listening to the newly surrendered tapes. It was then that they found it. The conversation from June 23, 1972, just 6 days after the break-in. The conversation in which Nixon had explicitly approved the plan to use the CIA to thwart the FBI investigation. It was all there, on tape. It was the smoking gun. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. It was irrefutable proof that the president had been part of the criminal cover-up from the very beginning. The transcript was released to the public on August 5, 1974. The political ground gave way completely. Even Nixon's most loyal defenders in Congress, the men who had stood by him for months, abandoned him in droves. They had been lied to, and they were furious. On August 7th, 3 of the most powerful Republicans in Congress, Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, Senate Minority Leader Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania, and House Minority Leader John Rhodes of Arizona, paid a visit to the Oval Office. Their message was grim and direct. The president's support in Congress had completely collapsed. Goldwater told him he had at most 15 votes in the Senate, not nearly enough to survive a trial. His impeachment by the House was a certainty, and his conviction and removal from office by the Senate were now a foregone conclusion. The end had come. For the next 24 hours, Nixon agonized over the decision, even contemplating fighting on, but it was hopeless. On the evening of August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon addressed the nation from the Oval Office. He looked tired and drawn, but he was calm and composed. He announced that he would resign the presidency effective at noon the following day. He admitted no guilt, acknowledged no crimes. He said he was resigning because he no longer had a strong enough political base in Congress to govern effectively. The next morning, in the East Room of the White House, he gave an emotional, rambling, and at times tearful farewell to his cabinet and staff. "Always remember," he told them, "others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself." A few moments later, he and his family walked across the South Lawn to a waiting helicopter. On the steps of Marine One, he turned, forced a final, weary smile, and gave his signature victory wave. Then the door closed and the helicopter lifted off, flying over the monuments of the city he had once commanded. Down below, his vice president, Gerald Ford, was preparing to take the oath of office, telling the wounded nation that our long national nightmare is over. A month later, on September 8, 1974, President Ford granted Richard Nixon a full, free, and absolute pardon for any and all crimes he may have committed as president. The pardon was intended to heal the nation, but for many it felt like the final act of the cover-up, denying the country a final accounting and ensuring that the man at the center of the greatest political scandal in American history would never face his day in court. Richard Nixon, the great survivor, the master of the comeback, had finally been defeated, brought down not by his political enemies, but by his own hubris, his own paranoia, and the contents of his own secret tapes. On August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon became something he had never been in his adult life, a private citizen. He retreated to his sprawling oceanfront estate in San Clemente, California, a property he had christened La Casa Pacifica, the Pacific White House. But there was no peace to be found there. He was a man in exile, a political pariah. The pardon from President Ford a month later, while saving him from criminal prosecution, did little to soothe his soul. In fact, for many Americans, it was a final confirmation of his guilt, a deal that denied them the catharsis of a trial. It spared him prison, but it sentenced him to a lifetime of public condemnation. The initial months after his resignation were a descent into a deep, dark depression. He wandered the halls of his home like a ghost, reportedly drinking heavily, his days and nights consumed by bitterness and rage. He listened to the tapes of his old conversations, obsessively reliving his triumphs and his downfall. He was a king without a kingdom, a man stripped of the power and purpose that had animated his entire existence. His health, always precarious, collapsed. In October 1974, he was struck by a severe bout of phlebitis, a life-threatening blood clot. He was rushed to the hospital for emergency surgery and hovered near death for days. In a now famous photograph, he appeared gaunt and frail, a broken man on the brink of oblivion. The near-death experience seemed to shake him from his stupor. He had survived, and Richard Nixon, above all else, was a survivor. Survival meant fighting back, and fighting back meant reclaiming his own narrative. He also faced financial ruin. His legal bills were astronomical, totaling more than $1 million. He owed a massive sum in back taxes that the IRS had assessed during the scandal. He was forced to sell his beloved home in Key Biscayne, Florida, and eventually he would have to sell La Casa Pacifica itself. To a man who had spent his life escaping poverty, the prospect of financial collapse was a profound humiliation. He needed money, and he needed a platform. This dual necessity would set the stage for the next phase of his life, a long, arduous, and astonishingly calculated campaign for redemption. His first major step was to write his memoirs. For a staggering advance of over $2 million, he sequestered himself and began the monumental task of telling his life story. The resulting book, R.N., The Memoirs of Richard Nixon, published in 1978, was a massive, sprawling work. It was a detailed, often self-serving account of his career, filled with powerful recollections of his foreign policy triumphs. When it came to Watergate, however, he was evasive, blaming his subordinates, the press, and his political enemies. He admitted to mistakes in judgment, but he stopped far short of confessing to any crimes or impeachable offenses. The book was a commercial success, but it did little to change public opinion. For that, he would need to face the nation in a different forum. The opportunity came in the form of a series of televised interviews with the British television personality David Frost. At the time, Frost was known more as a light entertainer and talk show host than a hard-hitting journalist. Nixon and his team believed he would be a soft touch, an easy foil who would allow the former president to present his case to the American people on his own terms. It was a massive gamble for both men. For Nixon, it was a chance to reclaim his voice and earn a much-needed $600,000 fee. For Frost, who financed the project himself after the major American networks turned him down, it was a chance to shed his lightweight image and make television history. The interviews, broadcast in the spring of 1977, became a national event, a captivating piece of political theater watched by an estimated 45 million Americans. For 12 sessions, the two men sparred, a cat-and-mouse game of evasion and pursuit. Nixon was, at times, brilliant, charming, and commanding, a vivid reminder of the formidable intellect that had taken him to the presidency. But it was the final session, the one dedicated entirely to Watergate, that would define the entire series. Frost, armed with meticulous research from his team of investigators, transformed from a deferential host into a relentless prosecutor. He cornered Nixon on the details of the cover-up, the hush money, the lies. For over 2 hours, Nixon bobbed and weaved, deflecting and denying. Then, Frost went for the knockout. He asked Nixon about the 18.5-minute gap, about the abuses of power, and he argued that by not admitting wrongdoing, Nixon was forcing the American people to live with a clouded history. Finally, under the weight of Frost's persistent questioning, the carefully constructed dam of Nixon's denial began to crack. In a moment of stunning candor, Nixon offered something akin to an apology. "I let down my friends," he said, his voice heavy. "I let down the country. I let down our system of government and the dreams of all those young people that ought to get into government but think it's all too corrupt. I let the American people down, and I have to carry that burden with me for the rest of my life." Then came the most chilling and revealing exchange of the entire series. Pushing Nixon on the illegal break-in at Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, Frost asked if a president could authorize something illegal if he believed it was in the national interest. Nixon's response was breathtaking. "Well," he said, his voice dropping, "in the Frost interviews, Nixon said when the president does it, that means it is not illegal. A statement critics saw as revealing his expansive view of executive power. It was a glimpse into the very soul of the imperial presidency, an articulation of a belief in executive power so absolute, so untethered from the rule of law, that it explained in a single sentence the entire Watergate tragedy." The Frost interviews did not absolve Richard Nixon, but they provided a form of public trial, a raw and riveting confession that he had never offered in a court of law. It was a painful, necessary act of national catharsis. The interviews marked a turning point. Having faced his demons in public, Nixon began the final and most successful phase of his post-presidential life, his transformation into an elder statesman. He and Pat moved from the isolation of California to the bustling East Coast, first to New York City and then to a quiet suburb in New Jersey. He systematically rebuilt his reputation by focusing on the one area where his expertise was undeniable and his legacy largely celebrated: foreign policy. He became a prolific author, writing 9 more books after his memoirs, most of them insightful analyses of global affairs. He traveled the world, meeting with the new generation of leaders in China, in the crumbling Soviet Union, and in the Middle East. He was no longer representing the United States, but his analysis and his access were invaluable. Slowly, carefully, he was welcomed back into the fold. Presidents and presidential candidates began to make the quiet pilgrimage to his home in New Jersey to seek his counsel. Ronald Reagan consulted him. George H.W. Bush sought his advice on the collapse of communism. Bill Clinton, a Democrat who had protested against Nixon's war, called him for his insights on Russia. He had achieved a remarkable, if incomplete, rehabilitation. He was no longer the disgraced exile of San Clemente, but the sage of Saddle River, a respected voice on the world stage. So, who was Richard Nixon? How do we reconcile the visionary statesman with the paranoid criminal? This is the central question of his life. His dark side is undeniable and profound. Watergate was not just a political scandal, it was a constitutional assault that shattered America's faith in its government, a wound that has never fully healed. His divisive Southern strategy exploited racial tensions and helped create the bitter partisan polarization that plagues politics today. And yet, any honest accounting must also acknowledge the extraordinary achievements. His foreign policy was revolutionary. The opening to China and détente with the Soviet Union were acts of incredible strategic genius that made the world a safer place. Domestically, his legacy is surprisingly progressive. He created the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and signed the foundational laws that protect our air and water. In the end, Richard Nixon was a figure of Shakespearean complexity. He was the insecure outsider who climbed to the highest peak, only to be brought down by his own inner demons. His funeral in 1994, attended by 5 presidents, was a testament to his undeniable impact. As President Clinton said, we must judge him on his entire life and career. That life remains a chilling cautionary tale about the nature of power. It is the story of a man who changed the world, but who could never conquer the darkness within himself.